Welcome to the Duke alumni and friends to this session of our Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. I'm your host, Tish Futrell, Director of Academic Engagement on the Lifelong Learning Team. And thank you for joining our program, Constructing the Gothic Wonderland. This program is part of our theme, Contextualizing 100 Years at Duke, which will examine the economical, societal, technological, and societal layers that built Duke's foundation and made it into the university it is today. Today's program is the first session in the Contextualizing 100 Years at Duke series, which explores the construction of Duke's iconic West Campus. Joining us today as our host and moderator is Rebecca Patillo, the Assistant University Archivist for Research Services and Student Engagement at the Duke David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Rebecca provides university history-specific reference and instruction and collaborates directly with student groups to ensure their history is preserved in the archive. Before coming to Duke, she worked at the University of Louisville Archives and Special Collections, the Indiana Historical Society, and the Indianapolis Museum of Art Library and Archives. She received her Master of Library Science and an MA in Public History from Indiana University, Indianapolis in 2016. Again, welcome to the Forever Learning Institute. Rebecca?
Thanks, Tish, for that wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion, Constructing the Gothic Wonderland, 1925 to 1950. Today, we'll be exploring the early days of the university's construction and how the iconic collegiate Gothic campus came to be, alongside the evolving economic and labor conditions in the South. So some of you might be thinking, I thought Duke was older than 100 years. And well, you're right, sort of. So the university traces its origins to a small school that opened in 1838 in Randolph County. It was originally a preparatory school for young men called the Union Institute Academy, and it was then later chartered as a teaching college named Normal College in 1851. The school then underwent another transformation in 1859 when it turned to the Methodist Church for financial support. And reflecting this new partnership was when the school changed its name to Trinity College, which you may all be familiar with. And the leaders of the college suggested that moving to an urban setting would attract more students, faculty, and financial support. And so after a spirited competition among regional cities, Trinity opened in Durham in 1892. Local tobacco magnates Washington Duke and Julian S. Carr, they assisted in providing land and money to Trinity. And in 1897, at Washington Duke's request, the school began admitting women as regular students, which made it an early co-educational institution. So fast forward 32 years, when in 1924, James B. Duke established the Duke Endowment, which is one of the largest philanthropic foundations of its time. And over the course of several gifts, the university received around $19 million from the Duke Endowment. So Trinity College then changed its name to Duke University in honor of J.B. Duke's father, Washington Duke. And this funding was really crucial for the development of the university, including the construction of not only East Campus, but its iconic West Campus. And then following J.B. Duke's death in 1925, about an additional $67 million was added to the Duke Endowment, which enabled it to continue its support of Duke University, even as the country faced financial challenges of the 1920s and 1930s. And this long-standing and long-lasting financial foundation has supported the university for decades, and it ensures that Duke has remained resilient and able to grow into the world-class institution that it is today. So through the lens of Duke's architecture, we will be exploring how these financial and historical forces shaped the campus. We'll discuss the visionaries who designed the campus, the laborers who built the campus, and complex relationships between the physical and social dynamics of the Jim Crow South that influenced the university's development. Our presenters today are Dr. Bob Korstad, Professor Emeritus of Public Policy at Duke University, and Dr. Hannah Ontiveros, lecturer at Binghamton University, who also received her PhD from Duke University. So Bob, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Thanks, Rebecca. It's wonderful to be here. and I'm a native of North Carolina. I grew up in Greensboro. I went to Chapel Hill and got eventually my PhD there too in history. And then I began teaching at Duke in public policy and history and taught for 30 years and retired in 2020. I'm a labor historian. I do African American history, history of social welfare, voting rights. In a public policy department, I did a lot of different kinds of histories. I was also the creator and one of the directors of a project called Behind the Veil: African American Life in the Jim Crow South, which is a centerpiece of the John Hope Franklin archives at the Rubenstein Library, and a collection of over 1,500 oral history interviews we did with African Americans in the South who came of age before the Civil Rights Movement. It's an incredible collection, mostly digitized and available to the public now, and I hope you take a look at it. There are also thousands of family photographs that we included in that, so it's a really interesting collection. I was also at Duke involved in a lot of different civic engagement and leadership programs, the Hart Leadership Program. I was the director of the Being Duke program for a number of years, worked on the Robertson program, Duke Engage. And right now, I'm the research director of a new project that's kind of involved with the Centennial called the Melinda Project, which is studying the history of slavery, segregation, and their aftermath at Trinity College and later Duke University. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that project as we move along.
Hi, I'm Hannah Ontiveros. I'm a lecturer at Binghamton University up here in New York, but as Rebecca mentioned, I did my PhD at Duke. I'm a historian of 20th century US history, particularly foreign policy, but also labor. Most relevant to today's topic, in 2018, I was a graduate mentor for a Story Plus program called Stone by Stone, where I led a team of undergraduate researchers who researched construction of Duke's West Campus. We initially sought out to research construction of the chapel specifically, and then found that we really needed to sort of expand our scope. Ended up conducting a study on some of the laborers and the labor conditions of building West Campus.
Great. All right. I'll hop in with the first question. So Duke's expansion during the early 20th century positioned it as a leading institution in the South. How do you think the regional context, including the economic, social, and race-related conditions in the South, shaped Duke's ambitions and its ability to grow during this time?
Right. Well, that's a great question to start with. The Duke University was created 100 years ago, as you said. And with the building of Duke West Campus, Duke was in many ways a completely new place. And it was new and fresh and, looking out in the world in a very different way. But we've been finding, and I would argue that the history and the culture of Trinity College heavily influenced this new place we call Duke. And it's, I think, really important to look back and understand this. As Rebecca mentioned, Trinity was formed in a very small town not far from where I grew up in Randolph County. Braxton Craven, who was the longtime president of the college, was a slaveholder along with other faculty and I think virtually all of the trustees at that time. When they moved to Durham in 1892, thanks to the efforts of President Crowell and then the Duke family and Julius Shakespeare Carr, Trinity brought a lot of baggage with it, figuratively and literally. Some of the things that it brought with it were really strong ties to the Methodist Church, which have been eroded bit by bit over the years. It brought a structure and system and a belief in racial segregation. So it was an all-white school with all-white faculty. And which was nothing unusual in the South. It was mostly students from North Carolina, a scattering at that time of students from elsewhere in the South. And it was really very much tied still to the Old South. We're not very far past the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Okay, that's not really surprising. If you look at the courses that are being taught, the things that students are writing about, some of the research that's being done, it's really it's looking backward in the whole creation of the historical society here, which was fabulous, but it was trying to really grapple with the kind of modernization that was taking place in the context of this old world. Now, there were a lot of things new about Trinity in Durham, and I think those are important to understand too. One of the things was very quickly it started hiring better faculty and more faculty. It had more students. Most of those faculty members with, they might have come here with a master's degree, but over a few years, they had gotten their PhDs from Hopkins and Harvard and Columbia and other places. So it was a well-educated, well-prepared faculty in a lot of different fields. It's in an urban setting as opposed to a very rural setting. It's in an one of the major industrial cities in the South, tobacco, textiles, and so it's a very much a working class town that Duke kind of finds itself set down in. It's close to UNC, to Wake Forest, to North Carolina State, other major institutes of education. It's not isolated in the same way. I think the student body becomes more and better prepared than they had been, and part of that's the creation of the Trinity School, which was a preparatory school on campus run by Trinity College that prepared students for entrance into college, which a lot of didn't have that opportunity. There's also a much larger African American labor force in Durham. Durham already at that point was attracting large numbers of white workers, but also large numbers of African American workers. And that was something that Trinity could draw on in a way that it hadn't been able to in the past, and the workforce became much more came out of the African American community. Another thing I think is really interesting is despite the Duke's commitment to the Republican Party, Trinity College and its leadership was very much embedded and tied into the white supremacy Democratic governing of the state, particularly in the aftermath of the Wilmington riot and the white supremacy campaign of 1898 and 1900. Governors Jarvis and Aycock, who they named buildings eventually afterward, were very involved in the university. Farrenfield Simmons, who was the architect of the white supremacy campaign, was on the board of trustees, chairman a number of times, very influential. Judge Clark. So the university was very much now embedded in a world of state politics, which it had not been done before. And it still was also looking out, to the nation too. Booker T. Washington spoke here a number of times. President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, was here, so it was already looking out to a national community. I think that with Presidents Kilgo and President Few, and particularly with the support of Ben Duke, who I think gets not nearly the attention he needs and deserves in the creation of Duke University. I mean, he was the one who stayed here in Durham and really did a lot of the work that brought this together. But they started developing really great ambitions. Kilgo and Few in particular were ambitious for the school. They really expected Duke to become one of the top denominational colleges in the South, if not the country. In North Carolina, that meant competing with places like Davidson and Wake Forest. But in the South, it was competing with places like Emory and Vanderbilt. Um, and there was also a real thought to being a university that kind of competed with UNC. UNC was that kind of crazy social school over there of all these rich landowners' kids, and Trinity was a Methodist college with ethical principles and a more conservative kind of social vision. And the final thing was, I think that Duke starts recruiting more and more students from around the South. It's just a dribble for a while, but the other thing, just quickly, is that I think the past. We have to remember the past is very present in the new Duke. If you look at all the buildings, Craven Quad, Crowell, Few, Kilgo, East Campus is named after all kinds of people from the past. So they named when they create the women's college, they named the undergraduate male college Trinity College. And then also in things like football, and I mean, it's interesting that the football games, Dixie and the Confederate flag, were ubiquitous until. I'll just take a couple minutes more. I just want to talk a little bit about this project that I'm working on, because I think it says something about what this new place is going to be like. When I started this work on the Melinda project, I was really surprised that almost none of the written histories of Duke and Trinity even mentioned African American men and women. You couldn't even find the word Negro in the index of the books. And when I began looking more closely at the Trinity Chronicle, the Chanticleer, the archive, the Alumni Association in particular, the bulletins of that are really fabulous. I really started seeing these African American workers everywhere, to my surprise. They were, kind of ubiquitous on campus. They were cleaning the buildings. They cleaned the dorm rooms. They made the beds of the men every day and took the trash out, and their beer bottles and liquor bottles and their gambling paraphernalia from time to time. And they were, they were really, in a way, kind of, celebrities on campus. I mean, everybody knew who they were. And so we've done, over the course of the last couple of years, we eventually identified over 50 men who had worked in these jobs, and have done profiles on 15 or more already, and doing more. One of those is George Wall and George Frank Wall, for whom the Student Center on East Campus is being named for, and we'll celebrate that in a few weeks with University Day. But what's really interesting, I think, to me, and kind of interesting to think about, is just the complex relationships between these Black men and the students and stuff. And there's a lot of warmth in what the students say, but also a lot of kind of vicious racism, derogatory terms. It's a very complicated relationship between, I think, the student, the faculty. And a lot of that got carried over to the West Campus, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little later, about how those social relations and economic relations that happen in Trinity get carried over. So that's
Right.
a long answer to
Yeah.
a really good question, but I could talk for hours about it. So.
Hannah, did you have anything to add, or do you want to go on to the next question?
I just want to add like one quick thing to put us to fast forward us a little bit into the later part of the 20s, which is that those racial dynamics that existed at the early 20th century are still persisting in the 1920s, certainly when campus is being built. And something that we see around Durham and on Duke's campus particularly is sort of a confluence of somewhat expected patterns that come together in a way that I think is, in terms of Duke growing its influence, is useful to Duke, which is that on one hand, you have these systems of labor and hierarchy that you kind of expect to see in the Jim Crow South. And in addition to that, it's the Depression already in most of the South by the mid 1920s. The economy is, particularly in the more rural parts of the state, the economy is already in like pretty intense decline. And this trend of industrialists with immense amount of wealth building institutions they can name after themselves and their family members, which for many schools came a little bit earlier, is happening obviously at Duke across the first several decades of the 20th century. And this big influx of money in the 1920s means that not only does Duke have all of this cash, also has access to pretty, let's say, cheap labor because of the economic precarity that's growing in all across the country, but particularly in the South. And what we ultimately end up seeing is that wages in Duke construction are low, even lower than other industrialized Southern cities. And, you know, that's not great for the workers, but it does build this campus.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll definitely get into a little bit more about specifics about some of the laborers that built the university. So as we all know, Duke's West Campus, it's very known for its collegiate Gothic architecture. And I'm curious about like what were some of the major architectural influences behind its design, and why do you think the Duke leaders chose that type of architecture? And how important is the physical appearance of Duke's campus to shaping its identity as an elite institution? Dr. Ontiveros, did you want to start with that one?
I mean, sure, yeah. So obviously, as I mentioned, the Duke is really growing as a school in the context of these other universities that had been like developing, and they're making a concerted effort to make themselves this prestigious and beautiful campus. Part of that effort includes a tour of East Coast colleges that William Preston Few and Frank Clyde Brown go on in the spring of 1924. They take sketches, they write down notes, they take photographs, or they acquire photographs of all of these East Coast campuses, and they highlight the things that they think should be featured on building out Duke. This includes things that we obviously become really prominent in Duke's construction, like noting the kind of stone that other schools use and where they quarry their stone. So when they visit Cornell, here in Ithaca, where I am right now, they note that Cornell was built from locally quarried sandstone, right? When they visit Princeton, they go and ask people about the stone that's used at Princeton. So they have this notion of emulating the kinds of structures that other schools are using, but also emulating like material acquisition that other schools are using. And they also want to emulate things like they take note of where servants' quarters are built in other schools. They take notes of smoking or no smoking policies. They take note of obviously things like towers, which is really becomes like an important feature of the construction on Duke's campus. And another feature, they were somewhat obsessed with the tunnels that other schools had.
Yes, I was going to mention the tunnels if you didn't.
Yeah, they had like this deep fascination with the tunnels, and that Duke eventually had that are now the access is closed off. But so they're obviously like the kinds of institutions that they're visiting across the board are like very notable. Many of them historic places like University of Virginia, that places like Harvard and MIT. They're going to schools that they want to emulate. I would say in terms of how they're structured for teaching, but also in terms of reputation. They want to emulate the reputation of these schools.
Dr. Korstad, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think the contrast, one of the interesting things, the contrast between the East Campus, and because there's a lot of building that goes on there too. And, they stick with a much more traditional, type of architecture, more Georgian, I guess, a mix of different things. And so it has its own, kind of distinct character and identity. And I think there was probably in creating these two campus, and because at one point, they really wanted just to expand the East Campus, and the land got too expensive and more problematic, and the Dukes just bought all this land over here. But I think there was a sense of creating these two different cultures in a way, and those, in creating the women's college there, which had been something that Washington Duke had really demanded when he started giving money in the 19th century. It becomes a pride for the university in its own particular way. Have this self-governing kind of women's college. They hire a really important dean. They give a lot of autonomy to the women so it's interesting how these two places kind of play off against each other, and it's still happening. It never ended.
Yeah, like the West is best. I hear a lot of students say West is best.
I mean, I think Nan Cohen's decision to create a first year campus over there was really quite daring, because it hadn't been that for a long time, and it gave it again its own kind of unique place in the culture of the university.
We even just got here in the archives just this week. We received a, an architectural drawing, watercolor painting actually, of East Campus as if West never existed. So it was very early on where they were designing the architectural firm, which we'll talk about next, designed the whole campus to be on East. And as Dr. Korstad said, the land just got too expensive. And so they kind of went around and kind of secretly and quietly bought up a lot of land on West and with the forest. So, but that's a great segue into our next question, which a chat participant, was asking about too. So can you talk about the architects that designed West Campus, and also who were the laborers that physically built the campus?
That's you, Hannah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So James B. Duke handpicked the architectural firm, Horace Trumbauer's architectural firm. Trumbauer had designed Duke's residence in New York, and so they'd worked together before. And the main architect that worked for Trumbauer was Julian Abel, who was the first Black graduate of the architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania. So Abel's name was expressly on architectural drawings of Duke Chapel. It was not on other drawings, but it is very likely that he did all of West Campus. That as for the workers, that is a diverse set of men, pretty much exclusively. When my team did our research, we found the name of one woman, and it was the woman who wrote down the wages of the men. It was not terrible. It was like racially diverse insofar as there were Black and white workers. It was not racially diverse much beyond that. There was some interesting sort of enclaves that were dependent on particular kinds of labor. So jobs like stonemasonry had these sort of patterns where a group of people who presumably trained together elsewhere would come to campus and work together on stonework, on things like the chapel. There's a town in Western North Carolina, Valdez, I think it's called, that was home to a community of stonemasons who built the town there, and then several of them came and worked on West Campus when it was being built up in the late 20s. The kinds of jobs available were somewhat were varied, as one would expect, from laborer, which was the lowest paid category that we had in the ledgers that we studied in my project. The average pay of that being, I think, like 26 cents an hour. The highest paying jobs were stonemasonry jobs that some of stonemasons made more than $1 an hour. The maximum, at least in that early period of building West Campus, the highest pay that we found for construction workers was $1.25 an hour. And I had a couple other things about this. There was also, as I mentioned earlier, a level of ability for Duke to hire people that was affected by economic conditions nationally and globally, insofar as basically you could pay people not a lot, and if somebody said, I'm not getting paid enough, you could likely hire somebody else to do that job with great ease. The result of this is that there were quite a lot of workers that we found in the ledgers who worked at Duke for a week or less. There were people who were seemed to be extremely transient, people who had very, very short-term jobs. And then there were construction workers who worked on Duke for decades. There was one man, Lucius Jester, who worked as a stonemason who helped lay foundations on West Campus in the 30s. And then he later worked on stonework on the Allen Building through the mid-1950s. So he was on Duke's campus for at least 20 years. So it's really a sort of varied experience. And additionally, there were students doing seasonal work on construction projects while West Campus was being built, which we, in our research project, found a little surprising. And there were, as I mentioned, there was a somewhat perhaps expected racial pay disparity. Black workers made around 69 cents on the dollar for each dollar that white workers made on average. That is hard to fully track down because of the limited data set that we had. So that's a sort of broad overview of some of the workers who built the campus.
I think one of the interesting things about the building of the campus and these ledgers that Hannah found and I've looked at pretty closely recently is just the way in which the whole kind of administrative process gets created. I mean, if you look back before that period of time at Trinity College, the employment records, wage rates, all this kind of stuff was just hit or miss. I mean, it's very little of it that remains, and what was there, I think, was pretty casual in the way it was done, just depending on whoever happened. But these ledgers are quite unbelievable, and so I think that there are a lot of ways in which the whole administrative process, the whole regulation of record keeping and stuff, it has to change as the university gets bigger, and there's a lot more money involved in this. It's a lot more serious endeavor. I think I'll just say one other thing about the new campus and the labor relations is that one of the things that happens is as they move the men all to West Campus, they hire African-American women as maids to do the cleaning, the kind of basic cleaning of the rooms, making beds, doing things like that, and the cleaning the restrooms in the men's dorms. And the janitors who had been doing that for 30 years by that point, kind of got more dispersed, just working on buildings as there are more and more buildings and doing some other odd jobs too. But that creates a whole, and I haven't found very much or anything really about why that happened in that particular way. May have something to do with the job market at that particular time, or some sense of what was appropriate. But that was a tremendous transformation, and they hired, there are fabulous pictures of this period of time of all the African American women who were made standing in front of the chapel after it was built and stuff. So there are a lot of interesting little tidbits like that about that history.
And with our last 5 minutes, it's clear that y'all have done a lot of research, a lot of archival research, and into Duke's labor, into the construction, into the institutional history. And so I'd love to hear from both of you in the last 5 minutes that we have about your research methods and about your archival explorations and how you went about that, and some of the materials that you consulted. I know you've mentioned the logbook and, just where you found that. And
You want to start, Anna, and then I'll kind of pick up?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So the research project that I worked on was, at least in its initial iteration, was a short-term-ish project. So we went into the university archives hoping to find, here's big lists of everybody that worked on Duke Chapel, and there's absolutely not what was available. That rarely ever pounds out how people want it to when you're doing archival research. But what we did find were pay ledgers that we were able to glean a lot of information from, using things like cross-referencing people's names with Ancestry.com, cross-referencing people's names with the Chanticleer to find, for example, student workers working in construction. We also had some really, really great help on this project because it had sort of started before the Story Plus project jumped on. So the university archives had been talking to people about the project before we jumped on, and had made some contacts that we were then able to use to conduct oral histories. So we talked to people whose family members had been construction workers at Duke, some of whom had been construction workers on the chapel and on West Campus, some of whose family members had worked construction in Duke, from the 30s to the 60s. What we ended up finding was, rather than here's a definitive story about labor conditions, it was rather a sort of group of smaller stories that patched together.
Yeah, I think the work that they did, I've duplicated some of that when we were able to find, as I started finding names, I found a few in ledgers and in university records, but a lot of them, were in the local newspaper when an African American person died, and it says he's, worked at Duke as a janitor for years, particularly with Carolina Times that starts getting published in the 1920s. There's a lot more about information like that. But the student publications, other university publications have been really helpful. I mean, one of the interesting things is that the Chanticleer staff, which starts in 1905, 6 something, or so early like that, they've got cameras, and they're all kind of candid pictures. So the only way we know what these janitors look like were the pictures that the Chanticleer staff took. And they're going around taking, the yearbook is full of pictures of all kinds of stuff, students and places and stuff, but they have janitors. So I think in doing this kind of research, you just say you have to be really resourceful about the kind of places that you look for information.
yeah, and just to give a plug for university archives, we are open to all. You don't have to be a student, you don't have to be an alumni, even though I know most of you are alumni. But anyone in the community can come in and do this research. You can come in and look at the same materials that Dr. Korstad and Dr. Ontiveros and the other members of her research team have looked at. So, who knows what you'll even discover when you come in. So, And also too, at the end, I believe we can send a follow-up where we can send links to the project that Dr. Ontiveros was worked on, Stone by Stone, and any other links, Dr. Corson, that you want to share too, and maybe some links to some of our university history pages in the university archives, so you can decide if you want to come in and do your own research too. And a lot of the materials we have are digitized. The Chanticleers that Dr. Corson mentioned are all digitized, so you can browse through them and look through them as well. So, and that's just one little thing that's digitized. We have a lot. So, okay. So for the questions, I know the answer to this. I'll see if our panelists know the answer to this. Is the story about Princeton turning down J.B. Duke true? Okay. Well, here we go. I know this one. So that is a myth. We aren't sure where this myth kind of originated, but we kind of speculate that it may have originated because Duke Farms, which was J.B. Duke's farmstead, was in New Jersey, about 20 miles away from Princeton. So, and also because Few and Brown, they traveled to a lot of those institutions, including Princeton. And a lot of the buildings here look very similar to some on Princeton. For instance, the chapel looks very similar to Princeton's Holder Hall. So that's kind of why we think maybe that myth kind of started, but we have not found any historical evidence to suggest that that is true. So, okay, let's see. Okay, as a student in the 5th class of African Americans at Duke, we never knew about Julian Abel and his role in designing buildings on campus. What is the story of how the university came to highlight his contributions publicly?
I don't know that. No.
To my recollection, that was like pretty recent that was in the discourse. I think like when I was in graduate school at Duke was when this got really talked about. And
it happened. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
It happened a little bit earlier. It was during, I think it's when you were in grad school was when the conversation was definitely more open, and when they did the dedication to the Abel Quad.
Yeah.
But it was during the university had some activism on campus for protesting divestment from South Africa during apartheid. And one of the Julian Abel's, I think, great-great-granddaughter, I think, was going to Duke and had written to the Chronicle about, my great-great-grandfather was a victim of apartheid at the institution that he created. And had said, like, he designed this campus. And so then we started doing research, and it was kind of there all along, had signed some of the materials as well. So yeah, I would say in the around the 80s is when we kind of started to know. And then I think in the 90s and then in the 2000s was when it really was being celebrated and giving Abel a little bit more of the, the credit that he deserved. So, okay, next question. Where did West Campus stone come from? And where did the brick for East Campus come from?
I know the stone comes from a quarry in Hillsborough. And an English professor is credited with discovering Hillsborough stone. I don't know where the brick comes from. That is a great question.
I think, Durham was the center of brick manufacturing. There were several African American brick makers, including I'm thinking Robert Fitzgerald, and there are two Fitzgerald men who do those, and those were big employers. And actual Fitzgerald's home and the brickyard was just kind of right between where the two campuses are these days in the West End. Almost all the bricks for the factories downtown he made, and my assumption is, at least in the early buildings, I think most of the brick was made right here in Durham. Maybe later, as they started building more, they might have gotten some from brickyards further away, but a lot of it was. Most of the stuff that built these two campuses, within 20 miles of here, which is pretty phenomenal. It it was a cost savings for one thing, and I think that was one of the reasons they picked. I mean, they found some yards in the Northeast, but the cost of getting that down here was, 10 times what it would be to buy it from Hillsborough.
Mhm. Mhm. I see there's a question about, is there a way to calculate what it would cost to build East and West Campus in today's dollars? I do have the numbers for what it cost in 1932, and I think you could probably pop it into into a calculator online. So the expansion and reconstruction of East Campus in 1932 cost $4,782,000 and some change. And then West Campus cost $16,373,000 and some change. So that was a lot back then. That's a lot now. So I'm sure it was very, very expensive. Okay, and let's see. Someone has asked. Now we're getting a lot of questions come in right when we have 2 minutes left. I don't know about if the Hillsborough Quarry is still being used. I don't think so. I think it's, but I really don't know. I don't know if either of you know that. And let's see. Was there a railroad constructed between West Campus and Hillsborough? There was a railroad that was kind of constructed on campus. We have old images of it that would bring the materials in as well. And see, and now people are helping to answer questions. That's great. And someone has asked to have Dr. Korstad comment on I'm sorry, I did not see your question, Ed, about Duke's first international student, Charlie Soong at Trinity, and the father of the famous Soong sisters who were instrumental in Chinese history. Do you know much about that, Dr. Korstad?
Not really. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I know he was an important student. It was, it's been part of the long history of the university. But I don't know very much about that.
Let me see if I have any others. Someone has asked what institution was East Campus modeled from. I think I know they went to University of Virginia. I think is pretty similar in like kind of the George or the and the architectural stylings.
Yeah, when they went to Virginia, I read a little bit of what they had written. They said that they didn't really like it. They were like,
Yes.
We don't really like this architecture that much, but they liked the layout, which I think that the sort of central quad of East Campus was modeled off of Virginia.
We do still have a few more minutes for questions.
There's a question on there about the Duke Gardens, which I think is an interesting one. I just was over there the other day walking around. It gets more fabulous every year, the more, different kinds of things they plant and stuff. But, I mean, I think it was a later thing written. I think it was built in the late 1930s. I think it was a variety of people, both people in the Duke family and also botanists on campus and other people who really and Mr. Duke, I think, wanted he foresaw a large garden, is kind of adjacent to West Campus, and he even had some grander ideas about a large lake. And I mean, one of the interesting things about even though there was a lot of money, as soon as they started building all these buildings and constructing West Campus, they ran out of money pretty quickly, and they had to really cut back on a lot of different things that some of the faculty wanted in terms of academic buildings and stuff like that in order to build the chapel, for instance. So there was a lot of money there, but the kind of ambition that Mr. Duke had laid out for the place kind of exceeded what the money was, and they're doing it in the midst of the Depression, so that's not unusual.
Someone has asked if it's true that there was a racetrack where East Campus is now.
Yeah, it was a racetrack, buggy race, whatever you call it, harness racing that Julian Carr owned, and they kept the circle where they for many years where the horses ran was part of kind of a driveway for the campus, and Carr he was he was a big horseman. He had another on his farm out near Hillsborough. He had another uh, uh, big racetrack that got turned eventually into a stock car race track, I think. So
Okay. I've got a 2-minute warning. So I wanted to ask again, I'm a little biased because I work in archives. So I kind of want to ask, like, while you were doing your archival research, what was something that you found that most surprised you during any of your research projects? It doesn't even have to be about this, but if you can elaborate on that.
I'll start. I think the university archives are completely underused. I'll just say that. I mean, there's lots of material that has been put in over the years that maybe nobody has ever looked at, or very few people. And it's a gold mine of understanding how the university functioned and how all the individuals on the campus interacted with one another. I mean, one of the most interesting things to me are the letter files from the presidents, which just have, people writing them all the time about all kinds of different things that maybe, they have no relationship to. They give you it's almost like letters to FDR,
Mhm.
Which, people are telling them their life stories and stuff. And you get a sense of that. And that's to some extent, particularly with the creation of the hospital, which we haven't really talked very much about. People, particularly in Eastern North Carolina, start seeing, the hospital becomes what represents Duke, not the university. And, people are afraid to come to the hospital in Durham because, if you go to Duke's, that's the last place you go, as you just go there to die. So it has people saw this as a important place, and the people who ran it as important people.
How about you, Dr. Ontiveros?
Yeah, I mean, I did mention this already, but I remember being slightly surprised, and the undergraduates I was working with being like completely just baffled because these were their peers, just like 100 years earlier, that there were students who were playing multiple sports, playing like baseball and football, and then also working construction jobs on campus. Like the I think our expectations of what working a campus job for a
Yeah.
student look like are much different in the 21st century. So it was somewhat surprising to see, and there are pictures where you can like identify some of the students, and to think like that, oh, that's a linebacker on the football
Mm.
team, and they're helping lift. They're doing a dangerous job without any safety stuff on at all. Was pretty wild to see. Yeah, and that was really only possible to discover through the archive.
Mhm. One thing that the Flickr account that y'all have in the university archives is phenomenal. And for people out there, if you're interested in this past, just go through and click. It's very well organized with different topics. And I think it's the quickest way to give you a sense of what the campus was like, what student life was like, what the architecture of the buildings were like. It's really, it's a great piece of work.
All right. I think we're good. You want to take it away, Tish?
Absolutely. Thank you, Robert, Hannah, and Rebecca for such a great session, and to our audience for joining us today.